Christof, thank you so much for joining me. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin, for having me on your show.
Pleasure. I mean, I've been following your work for many years. I remember when I was writing my dissertation, prior to that, you were one of the first people I actually stumbled upon who was purely focused on a very reductionist neurobiological approach to consciousness, and I really enjoyed that approach. I wanted to ask you, when you started out, I know you and Francis Crick did a lot of work together, and when you guys started out, I mean, you call yourself a romantic reductionist. Beautiful term. Love that. Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist is one of your books. Just by the way, I'm using consciousness as a fundamental property of complex things, one of your papers, towards a neurobiological approach of consciousness, another one. I think that one was with Francis Crick. And then your two books as well, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist, as well as The Feeling of Life Itself. So those will be the basic notes I've made, and most of my questions will be around those topics. When you describe yourself as a romantic reductionist, how do you think this definition impacts the way you view consciousness, or even your theory of consciousness in general?
Well, reductionist, because that's how science works, right? It reduces things down to the atomistic level, right? It's a very old approach going back to the, Lucretius and Democritus. We try to reduce everything and analyze everything at the smallest level possible where you can understand it, but then also romantic, because I look within that for a larger understanding of the whole, and that probably cannot be done at the reductionist level. It probably has to include large systems, quasi-systems, as systems, not just as a bunch of individual particles. Because consciousness is more than the simple contribution of a bunch of neurons in my head, obviously. And so trying to combine those tension, the tension to try to reduce it always to very local spatial temporal mechanism, but then also with consciousness, there is this holistic attitude.
When you think of the philosophical debate, there's different views. You have idealist views, panpsychist views, materialist views. Where do you think the integrated information theory and your theory of consciousness, where does it fall within these groups?
Well, like many people, if you look at any of the great philosophers, what their life they have evolved. So I grew up as a devout Catholic. I grew up in a Catholic family, and I took, in fact, my kids to church, and they got baptized and all of that. And then I lost that faith. So that's my personal story. From a scientific point of view, I started out, as you mentioned, with Francis Crick, just focusing on sort of an operational, intensely pragmatic and operational. Let's forget about all these isms, idealism. He mentioned some of the major ones, but of course there are hundreds of sub-variants. Let's forget all of them. Let's agree that consciousness is a thing. Of course, not all philosophers agree on that, but that is a thing. And then we look for its physical footprint, its material correlate, in our case in the brain, not in the heart as most of us thought historically, but in the brain using, all the modern tools. So that's sort of a very pragmatic approach, which is pretty neutral with this. As long as you accept that consciousness exists and needs to be explained, then it's pretty neutral with respect to the philosophical underpinnings you have. And then over time, I developed, I became very good friends with Giulio Cenoni, who's of course the psychiatrist and the neuroscientist. It's really his that blossomed into integrated information theory that I helped him, in some way to co-develop. And that really, it's very difficult to sort of pigeonhole into one specific. It's very well prescribed. In fact, of all the theories, whether they're right or wrong is a different matter, but of all existing theories of consciousness, integrated information theories are most precise. It starts from very simple axiomatic assumption, like the 5 or the 6 postulates, an axiom from which it derives postulates, from which it then sort of extrapolates and infers. So in that sense, it's very, very precise. It has aspects of idealism, it has aspects of panpsychism, but it also contains a strong dose of physicalism, because ultimately it's an operational theory. So that's the only thing you can do. You can observe and you can manipulate. You can observe a system like the brain or a computer or anything else. You can compute its transition probability matrix, right? You can see, well, if I increase this thing over here, the voltage on this neuron over here, or the voltage on the gate of the transistor over here, then over there I can see this thing happening, right? And I do that for all possible permutation. That's ultimately what it says. In that sense, it's very physical, but it also distinguishes these two different states of existence, absolute existence, phenomenal existence, intrinsic existence, existence for itself, so that's consciousness, from all other forms, from the other form of existence, which is existence for others, which is extrinsic existence, right? It's not absolute, it's relative existence. And between the two is this great divide of being. On the one hand, are conscious creatures that exist for themselves, and then you cross that divide, and then there's everything else, including my body, that exists for me or for others. If I go tonight to sleep, I will cease to exist for myself in a deep sleep when I don't dream, but my body will, of course, still be there and still exist for others. And so, this sort of attitude encompasses very different forms of philosophical ideas. So it's very difficult to sort of exactly pinpoint what sort of ism is it. It's not necessary. It makes precise predictions. That's all you need.
And when you look at it, one of the key concepts of IIT, Integrated Information Theory, for those listening, is the notion of phi. Which is the measure of the integrated information that the system possesses. How do you, when you look at this, how is it calculated and how does it relate to subjective experience? To someone who's not familiar with it, how would you describe that?
Well, so it starts out by making these axiomatic statements, which you can agree to or you can disagree with. So it starts out and says, well, consciousness exists. Otherwise, there's nothing to explain. It exists intrinsically for itself. So the only thing I have directly access to is my consciousness, right? I don't access the world. Das Ding an sich ist kein Selbst, right? All I have is impressions of the world, some of which, of course, seem to correspond to reality. Like I have an impression that there's somebody, Tevin is sitting in front of me in my Zoom box. But of course, I can also have hallucinations. So, consciousness exists. It's intrinsic. It has parts. Like I can see the left side, the right side, the upper side, the lower side. There are colors. There's motion. There's sound. So there's all these different things. It's highly differentiated. Every experience is very particular and different from in a very specific ways from every other experience. It's integrated, it's one, any one experience, it's one, it's holistic, and it has definite borders. There are certain things right now that I'm conscious of, but there are other things I'm not conscious of, like my blood pressure I'm not conscious of, or the feeling of pressure of on the soles of my feet. I can be conscious if I tend to that, but right now I'm not. And so then it takes these five axioms of phenomenology and says, well, let's look at a mechanism. How can this be instantiated? Well, I take a thing, a network, a simple network, could be neurons, could be transistors, could be anything physical, and then I say, well, let's translate each of these axioms into terms that I can measure at the level of this particular mechanism. And it starts out. Fundamentally, what does it mean to exist? To exist, this goes back to a comment by Plato. To exist means to exert power. I can exert power. I can lift, for example, this coffee cup. Right? You can also exert a certain power on me. Gravity exists because it exerts, forces on objects. Electric charge exists because, it can exert, forces, and they die off with one over distance, etc., etc. So it takes that as fundamental. Ultimately, what exists is what has causal power to make and take a difference, and consciousness exists for itself. So you have a system. The system is conscious to the extent that it can exert power upon itself. In other words, its past state determines its current state, and the current state influences or determines the next state. So there's a cause to my current state, and there's an effect to my current state. These are all things that are operational, that can operationalize. Once I have a system, I can derive its transition probability matrix. I can derive all of these things. And then the theory says ultimately what consciousness is sort of all these different aspects of intrinsic power unfolded. So you look at a particular network of my brain, and you look at all possible combinations of 2 neurons and 3 neurons and 4 neurons interacting upon each other. All of that, sort of, the theory says you unfold it, which gives rise to this form, this mathematical form. And that's ultimately what consciousness is. And then phi, so phi said, so this is the quality of any one experience. Why time flows, why space is extended, why colors feel a particular way, with different hues. All of that has to be mapped from this unfolded causal power of the network. And then the quantity of consciousness, phi, the one that you mentioned, integrated information, is sort of the total, the irreducibility of the system. The more the system is irreducible, and this is quantified by number phi, it's a pure number, it's not measured in bits. If it's 0, the system doesn't exist. Strictly speaking, it falls into its components. You can divide it without looting. I mean, you can think about like the entropy of a system. If the entropy of a system is just the sum of the 2 individual entropies, and the system as a whole doesn't exist, you can really just treat it as 2 separate systems. Same thing with phi. To the extent the system is more and more irreducible, phi is higher and higher, and the system is sort of more conscious. They're more. It's capable in that particular state of more differentiation, of having more relationships. So it's a very mathematical, that's a good thing or the bad thing. It's a very mathematical way of thinking on it, but it says, so this identity, the theory is a very strong claim. The theory says there's an identity relationship between the unfolded intrinsic cause-effect power of a system in a particular state and the conscious experience of that particular system in that state. So in other words, every aspect of that system. So if that system, for example, is just looking at a blank canvas, right? You just have an experience. You're at night, it's pitch dark, and you just have your eyes open. All you see is sort of this spatial canvas that's totally empty, but there's space. So space means there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down. There's a neighborhood relationship, there's a distance relationship. And so all those things have to also be present in this unfolded intrinsic cause-effect power. And this has to be true for everything you're conscious of. Every desire, every hope, every fear, all of that somehow has to be is derived from the intrinsic causal power of the system in a particular state. And the theory is neutral with respect to what that system is. It just says any system that has this high intrinsic causal power, that has phi, is conscious, and there's no threshold. So phi doesn't have to be 42 before the system is conscious. Any system, and this is where it shares certain aspects of panpsychist intuition, any system that has a phi different from 0 will feel a little itsy bits like something.
Do you think it's that conclusion there, where it can apply to any system, and then its close association to panpsychism, that leads a lot of scientists to claim that it lacks a falsifiability factor?
Yeah, but that's simply not true. I mean, for example, it says in a particular network like the brain, the neural correlate of consciousness, if you want, is a system that has maximal phi. That is something in principle, not in practice right now, because it's way too complicated. But in principle, you can evaluate if there's a system that is larger than the one the theory says. If there's a different neural correlate of consciousness than the one the theory postulates, then the theory is wrong. So in that sense, it can be, at least in principle, clearly disproven. It makes interesting claims about, for example, if I take my brain and your brain and start connecting them, the theory says at some point there will be a discrete threshold. If I add sort of one more connectivity between my brain and your brain, where you and you and my conscience will disappear, and simultaneously there will be this single amalgamation of consciousness that's now based in two brains. So it makes all sorts of interesting predictions. But yes, it has its intuitions don't accord with some of the intuitions that we in the West particular have developed, mainly that consciousness is unique to us and a few other sort of charismatic megafauna like cats and dogs and great orcas and a few other preferential animals. One of the intuitions, one of the consequences, it may well be that almost every creature in the tree of life has some aspect of consciousness, feels like something. It doesn't mean a bee, has an idea of a weekend or of, being fat or anything like that, but it may well be that given the vast complexity of a bee's brain, 900,000 neurons, 10 times denser than our brain, it may well feel like something to be a bee when it's in the sunlight, it's just drinking some golden nectar. It may have some feeling, some little feeling of happiness. And some people reject that. They say, well, that's ridiculous. It's only us maybe, or maybe, apes.
Christof, tell me, when you looked at these 5 properties, you took into account intrinsic experience, composition, information, integration, and exclusion. How did you come about gathering these concepts together and making these the fundamental concepts that the theory focuses on?
Well, because they seem
other factors as well.
Yeah, so when you stop, so for instance, we've thought, and Julian and I have discussed this at length, do you need another postulate? For example, do you need some sort of centeredness? Because it seems to be that there's an observing eye, at least in human adult conscious experience, right? I am looking at the world, right? But on the other hand, when you, under certain types of psychedelic experiences, this eye is totally gone, or when, I had a near-death experience, there was no more I, there was no Christof, there was no self, but whatever remained was this non-dual self that was highly conscious, in this case just of this luminosity and terror and ecstasy. So you can certainly, I don't think it's fundamental, yes, at least in humans, so in humans there is this I, but that doesn't mean that all animals have it. My dog probably has less of an I, and to what extent a bee has an I is very difficult to say, but it's not a universal claim that those 5 axioms are truly universal, and even a bee will have, the conscious experience of a bee will be, will have specific boundaries, will be differentiated, will be unitary, and will exclude certain things. Same thing we've argued quite a bit. Do we need a postulate regarding time? That there's always, again, in human experience, there always seems to be an aspect of time, time flowing. But we all know, for example, when you're in a state of flow, time can certainly change very differently. I used to rock climb, and when you do these big wall climbs, time perception really slows down dramatically. I used to jump out of planes. Time perception changes. Again, under psychedelic experiences, time changes, or again can come to a complete stop where there is no more time. There is something, but it's neither too long nor too short. It just is. So that tells me that there are experiences without passage of time, and therefore passage of time cannot be a fundamental axiom of conscious experiences.
These causal structures, they're fundamental to this theory. How does it relate to other theories of consciousness, like, let's say, global workspace theory or higher order theories?
It doesn't. It's fundamentally different. So higher order theory and certainly global neuronal workspace theory, there's some psychological theories. Certainly global neural workspace, they have memory, they have this intuition, which I think is true, that once information is consciously accessible, it's sort of broadly broadcast to many other systems. IIT doesn't have that. It doesn't have a notion of a self. Clearly, ultimately we will need to explore and explain the notion of self, but IIT per se doesn't have a sense of self, because that would only occur in very high level consciousness, like in us, and even probably not in a fetus, and maybe not even in a newborn, but maybe in a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old child, and then of course the self becomes ever more stronger. So in that sense, it's different. Now, you probably may know there's this competition, there's this adversarial collaboration funded by the Templeton Foundation. There's several of these. 2 of them, in fact, the one that's most advanced, is this adversarial collaboration between GNW and IIT. And they came up with it's a large collaboration involving 12 labs in a variety of countries, in China, the US, and in Europe, and Israel, comparing several predictions of. Let me back up. The trouble with most or almost all theories of consciousness, people test their own theory, and then almost always find something in support of their own theory, and so conclude, well, this supports my theory, and obviously doesn't agree with anyone's else theory. Yeah, it's very difficult to make progress in this way. So what we together with the Templeton Foundation, we had this initiative where we had a meeting at my institute here in Seattle. We got together, Stan Hain and Giulio Ciannoni and a bunch of other, Dave Chalmers, a bunch of other philosophers and scientists, where we say, okay, let's agree to look at specifically IT and GNW. Can we set up an experiment that would actively, one outcome would be in favor of IIT and the other outcome would be in favor of GNW, but doing 1 or 2 experiments, right? Rather than having 2 totally different things that are very difficult to compare. So we did this both in humans and in non-human primates and in mouse. The human is most advanced and will be revealed next month at the ASSC conference in New York, where we are testing in 2 experiments in like 100 people or something, using fMRI, EEG, MEG, and ECOG arrays in patients. 2 predictions. Where is the neural correlate of consciousness? And primarily, is it in the back? It doesn't really require the front, or is it in the front? And B, what's the exact timing relationship? So GNW says consciousness, when I become conscious of something, I broadcast it. But then if I'm just, let's say I'm looking at you for 10 seconds, it's not maintained during those 10 seconds. But I become conscious of you, there's this broadcast, and then maybe when you disappear, there's another sort of broadcast. While IIT says, no, as long as I'm conscious of you, as long as I look at you and I see you clearly, there will be a correlate, there will be a physical substate of consciousness. So those are 2 predictions, where and what relationship with time that we can test, and we can see which one of these theories is the correct one. So that's ongoing right now, and the first experiment will be published and all the data made available in over the next few months.
Well, that sounds very exciting. I'm really looking forward to that. One of my questions was going to go into the complex interdisciplinary approach you guys have taken with this. You guys incorporate physics, biology, chemistry, philosophy, neuroscience. It's all incorporated into this theory. And it's always great to see something. That's what I love about reductionism in the first place, is that you are going to take a very multidisciplinary approach to the topic when you do that. Tell me, what are some of the challenges of doing this? And what do you see either hindering the work progress in this theory, or even helping it moving forward in the future with new technologies like artificial intelligence? We've got ChatGPT nowadays. How do you see the progress moving forward?
Well, there are lots of different questions. For example, most theories, including us, make the assumption that neurons are probably the right level of granularity, because you have to ask at what level of granularity is consciousness best explained. If you're an arch reductionist, you would say, well, ultimately it's got to be at the most fundamental level, because everything, the causation flows upwards. But of course, that may not be true, given the causal power of systems. It may not at the bottom, but at some intermediate stage, depending on the noise and the trade-off between reduction, redundancy and degeneracy. And is quantum mechanics relevant? So, for instance, we've had many discussions, with lots of people, including Roger Penrose and Stu Hammer. To what extent does IIT need to adopt sort of a quantum mechanical approach? Right now, I think the bets are still heavily in favor of the fact that the brain is, at the temperatures that the brain operates, which is hot by quantum mechanical measures, and the scale at which brains operate, over the volumes of at least a cubic millimeter, which includes, billions of of atoms, that at that scale we can neglect quantum mechanical effects and just sort of assume the brain is a classical system. But that's a fundamental question that has to be explored. How far does consciousness go? When does it start? It doesn't start in the fetus is a question that's being explored. How far does it extend in the tree of life? And then, of course, the big question is, you mentioned large language models. To what extent can large language models or any sort of AGI be considered conscious? And there again, the theory, because it proceeds from some fundamentals, strongly disagrees with the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist, and certainly here on the west coast of the US, the sentiment is, many of my friends work at Google, the sentiment is that, of course, these machines will ultimately be conscious. Are they conscious right now? That's something we can debate, but of course, in the fullness of time, they'll be conscious because they'll be as intelligent as humans. But of course, then you have to think, well, to what extent is intelligence, which is ultimately about doing things in complex environments with a variety of different agents active and learning from these environments and generalizing. To what extent does that relate to consciousness, which is ultimately a state of being? And IIT argues, again, from first principle, that these systems will be able to do anything that humans can do, right? There's no reason why ChatGPT won't be able to write War and Peace in in 2 more iterations, right? It goes at a breathtaking speed, right? The double time of these models in terms of parameters is 4 months. So in a year from now, the power will increase by a factor 8, right? So maybe they'll write the next Lord of the Rings. Who knows? In a year from now. But that doesn't mean that it's conscious. In fact, IIT argues that that given the causal power of the underlying hardware, which is really where the action is, you have to look at the metal gate, one transistor connected to another transistor. These machines will not be conscious. And so they'll fake it. They'll fake it increasingly more successful, but it'll all be a deep fake.
Yes. That's fascinating, because I remember when I first read your book, it was one of your first papers, actually. When I first read it, the assumption I drew from that was that you are actually making the indirect claim that an artificial intelligence could be considered conscious at any point. But then obviously when I read The Feeling of Life itself, you clearly answer that question. Do you think the initial papers did sort of portray that image, or did I just completely misinterpret that?
No, because in my first paper with Francis Crick, we really didn't, except maybe a line at the very end, we didn't really think about it. Look, a priori, there's no reason why artificial engineered systems can't be conscious, right? We are conscious. We are a physical material thing that's subject to all the laws of physics. Right? Once you throw out the soul, the soul that's only unique to us, and that, in the fullness of time, once I die, goes to God. If you don't believe in that notion anymore, then sort of all bets are off. And in principle, any complex systems can be conscious. The argument is more with respect to IT. It's not that there's something fundamentally wrong with these digital computers. It's just that if you look at the actual causal power of a digital computer, so you have to look at the CPU. It doesn't matter what it simulates. You actually have, just like with neurons, you have to look at the level of the mechanism, which is one transistor with its gate and the base and the emitter connected to 3 or 4 other transmitters. And does that across vast fields of transistors, right? 4 billion transistors or 3 billion transistors in your iPhone, right? But if you compare that compared to the connectivity of the brain, where you have one neuron that gets input from 10 to 50,000 other neurons, and that projects to 10 to 50,000 other neurons heavily overlap, compared to 3 to 4 transistors converging onto one transistor gate, and the emitter of the transistor channel being connected with 2, 3, or 4 other transistor gates. It's a huge difference in the level of the underlying intrinsic causal power. So in principle, if you build machines in the image of man, in other words, if you build so-called neuromorphic computers, right? Neuromorphic computers, some companies, IBM tried to build one a couple of years ago, where you actually build at the level of the hardware, you build in the similar connectivity that we have in our neurons, then yes, the system will be in principle as conscious as a human. But a digital machine right now is not conscious. Think about the following. This is a nice example I like to use. I have a friend at Caltech. She programs the field equation of Einstein's equation of general relativity to simulate the black hole at the center of our galaxy. Okay, Sagittarius A star. Now we know it's 6 million or 4 million solar masses, so it's so powerful that the mass will distort, space-time around it, and nothing can escape, including light, which is why it's called a black hole. But if I simulate it, or my friend who simulates it doesn't have to be afraid that she's going to be sucked into this black hole her computer is modeling. Well, why not? Now you might say, well, that's a stupid question. She's just simulating it, right? But that's the same thing with consciousness. So assuming I have this super powerful, accurate simulation of the human brain on my laptop, right? Give me 20 years. Now I have a quantum machine implemented on my Apple, right? It's the latest Apple model. It has quantum engineering in it. I simulate a human. And of course, if the simulation is accurate, my laptop will act like a human, right? Because if it's a good enough simulation of the human brain, it'll behave like you or I. But again, that's a difference between just behaving and actually having the causal power. So just like you cannot simulate the causal power of gravity, you can simulate certain aspects of it, but that doesn't mean that you have the causal power of gravity to bend, to curve space-time. Same reason it doesn't get wet inside a computer simulating a rainstorm. Think about it. Same thing. Right? You say, well, that's silly. Of course it doesn't get wet. Well, same thing with consciousness. Of course it's not conscious, because consciousness is causal power upon itself, and you can't simulate that. You can simulate behavior. So my short version is computers can do anything we can do, but they cannot be what we are, namely conscious. Digital computer.
Very well poetically said that. Tell me, Christof, when you look at a physicalist approach to consciousness, I mean, some people, when you start at a very physical, neurobiological approach, it seems to diverge into pretty much around three main philosophical views when it comes to like emergentism, a sort of panpsychist view, and then maybe illusionism. I know you don't want to talk about the isms, but what do you think when people talk about the fact that there is no consciousness? I mean, this is just a flaw in thinking. It's just something we've attributed to ourselves, but we're no different than anything else.
I refuse to. This is gaslighting. This is pure gaslighting, okay? Telling me that I don't have these feelings, right? But it doesn't work. You can't cancel consciousness. I mean, you can try, and some people do. They make their reputation from it. But, the next generation, of course, going to say, well, obviously that's silly.
Because if someone like Keith Frankish, I mean, he calls it quasi-phenomenal experiences. So although that we consider phenomenological experiences to be valid and on point, if you just change the word to quasi-phenomenal, you actually describe it as something that's possibly there and happening, but not necessarily what we're defining it to be. What is your response to that?
I mean, it just begs, just by adding quasi, so how do you tell something quasi from something that's supposedly real? Where's the difference? It's just a preamble quasi.
When you and Tononi got together and started doing this, was there anything that triggered you down this route? I mean, what really got you interested in this topic, and because you guys have done so much work since then. From starting with Francis Crick to working with Troendle now, what really got you into this field? Toothache. Yes, I think I did watch you say that once in an interview.
A toothache. I was lying there a long time ago, and I had this toothache. It was really bad, and I was trying to distract myself. I took already, pain medication. It didn't really help. Then you wonder, well, where's ultimately the toothache coming from? It doesn't really make any sense. I mean, it's just, okay, there's the trigeminous branch of the nerve is inflamed and goes down here and goes into my spinal cord and then switched over to the thalamus up and goes into, the somatosensory cortex. But ultimately, it's just iron sloshing around. It's sodium potassium iron sloshing around my brain. And there are all sorts of iron sloshing around in my body, my kidney, my liver, and, they don't do anything. So why is it that certain iron sloshing around in this part of the brain give me pain, and over here they give me pleasure? It just doesn't. I mean, that's really the fun. I mean, that's the heart of the mind-body problem. In fact, I remember a couple of years afterwards, I had this correspondence with Dan Dennett. This is after we had met and we had this what I called absurd debate about the non-existence of pain, because I had to abort my climbing trip in the Sierras in California because there was this god-awful pain. And you lie there at night, you can't sleep, it's pounding, and you just tell yourself, well, it's all just an illusion. It's all just pure fake, pure illusion. I'm just confused about it. It doesn't help you one bit. It doesn't help you at all. It's still as phenomenal, as real. In fact, in that moment, nothing is more real than your pain. And so saying it's quasi-phenomenologically or you're confused, it's the illusion, all of that just, crashes into the reality of the experience.
When you think of the phenomenological feeling of consciousness, I mean, obviously in that scenario, Dennett is coining qualia, which is pretty much his paper on how we should view qualia. But when you think of phenomenological experiences, does that form the basis of your entire approach for consciousness? Do you feel like that's where you make your starting point in general?
Yeah, because that is ultimately the only thing. I mean, this is, I grew up in a French school system. I went to a school in Morocco called Lycée Descartes, right? So, nomen est omen. Yes, I start with that fundamental insight. The only thing for sure I know I exist. It's Neo in the Matrix, right? It turns out he's completely confused early on, where he actually lives, or what the actual state of the world, but there's no confusion that he exists.
I mean, Descartes spoke about the pineal gland. I know you and Crick, when you started off, you mentioned the claustrum as a fundamental aspect there. Where's that gone from then to now? How's that changed?
Okay, let me defend René Descartes, because people say, well, that's ridiculous. So he dissected animals himself, and he erroneously, if you remove the pineal gland, the animal would die. So I think that's just bad preparation, or they had very primitive tools, of course, at the time. And furthermore, he did the structure-function relationship. He said, well, everything in the brain exists in two copies, left, right. But clearly, consciousness is unitary. So therefore, we have to look for a unitary structure. I mean, this makes a great deal of sense, right? We argued the Claustrum. So right now, so we've done, a lot of other people since then have done experiments where you try to inactivate the Claustrum primarily in mice. It hasn't really been done in any other animal. And it seems like the Claustrum is involved in sleep regulation, so turning consciousness on and off, and in attention. So at this point, it's unclear whether it relates directly to conscious experience. We simply don't know. Again, we did the structure-function inference. The Claustrum was unique. So the Claustrum, for your listeners, is an extended, it's sort of yay big, 2 inches long. It's very thin. It's underneath the cortex. It's above the basal ganglia, but underneath the cortex. It's highly connected. It speaks to basically all cortical regions. And it has these, we reconstructed them at my institute here at the IIT Institute. They are called crown of thorn neurons. They're incredible extensive. So a single neuron can extend both ipsi as well as contralateral, has these very extensive branches that cover entire dorsal mantle of the cortex, so they're quite unique. And we said, well, it's this widespread bidirectional connectivity between claustrum and cortex, so it may be the conductor of the cortical symphony. Whether that turns out to be right remains to be seen.
When you talk about that neuroanatomy, for example, have you guys done much work on sort of psychopathology and its implications on IIT, certain neuropsychiatric conditions, and how it impacts your theory?
I've discussed it quite a bit with psychiatrists. Mr. Julia himself is a psychiatrist, although not a practicing one. For instance, there are all sorts of interesting dissociations in the psychiatric literature. For instance, people claim to be blind. But if you look at their eyes, you look at their visual cortex, you do fMRI, everything looks normal. Now, either you can say, okay, they're just lying because they want to get benefits or something. And in some cases, that's true. But in other cases, that doesn't explain the facts. Plus, normal-sighted people who claim to be blind behave differently from truly blind people, so you can tell them apart. So what might be going on there, for instance, is that there's a sort of functional disconnection syndrome that, for whatever reason, sometimes it involves an accident, or sometimes emotional or sexual trauma, that the connections between visual cortex and the main part of consciousness, we call it posterior hot zone, is disconnected. Other things is called multiple personality syndromes, again, typically in people who as children were sexual, physically, or emotionally heavily abused. In a few cases, even a person who's sighted, but then when they get very anxious, I'm thinking of one patient, they go into this other persona, it's a female persona, and then they become blind. Okay, so now they're function blind, and you can say, okay, they're not exactly faking it, but clearly the brain cannot sort of radically disconnect. But then you look at the EEG, you do the simple checkerboard. What you do, you have a pattern checkerboard that reverses every second. All the white squares turn to black and the black turn to white. And the eyes are open. And in their normal sighted state, you can see clearly the reversal in the EEG. White, black, you can see it mirrored. When they're in their blind state, function blind state, the signal goes away. This is amazing. How can this be? Well, again, so per IIT, you can explain that. IIT also could explain that under some conditions there may be more than one consciousness inside one brain. So our experience is, I mean regular folks like you and I, that there's only one consciousness present, right? It's the one that typically is the one that speaks, with the dominant left hemisphere, etc. But it may be possible under a variety of normal conditions. I'm not talking not about pathology, but normal conditions where there may be a second sort of, IT says what's conscious is this maximum in cause-effect power. But there may well be conditions under which one maximum is here on the left that controls ultimately the focus area and talks. That's the one that talks to you. But there, under all sorts of conditions, there may be a second local maximum that's present just here that's independently conscious but doesn't control the output, like in a split brain patient. But this may also occur in normal people. So to test that, we need some tool that can sort of in real time, and we don't have that yet, in real time can track where are these hotspots of integrated information in the brain at any one point in time, and how do they develop, how do they evolve.
So tell me, how has your view with IIT and the way you perceive consciousness and understand it changed your way of perceiving the concept of free will?
Well, so per IIT, in fact, IIT, there's a paper now in bioRxiv, Troendle et al. This year. IIT is sort of argues for the strong version, not the compatibilist, but the strong version of freedom of will. Let's look at a typical free will scenario. There's a fork in the road. I can do A or I can do B. Okay? So there are these two conscious choices, these two conscious avenues, either A or B. I go to a restaurant and I see a nice dish with salmon, and I see a purely vegetarian dish. Okay? Now I can reason, well, I just wrote this morning and I haven't had salmon. I like salmon. On the other hand, I don't want to kill animals that are conscious, so I shouldn't eat salmon. So these are the two choices. There are reasons why I should do one or the other. Then there's this decision point. Okay, I'm going to decide to either go for the salmon or go for the vegetarian dish, and then you act upon it. You ask the waiter to get you one or the other. Okay, and you can sort of it's relatively straightforward to adapt the calculus of IIT, but now to do because ultimately it's based on causal power. In the brain, you can now derive where does this decision start. It has a clear, again, you look at maximum causal power, but now across space-time, across multiple states of the brain. So where does the decision begin? Then there's this deliberate process, and then you make a decision. You choose one or the other. You actively choose one or the other, and then you execute. You can compute the causal power that's associated with that, and it's not emergent. It's a view. It's a particular physicalist view of free will. As long as you have the capability, so not every brain can do this. A child's brain can do it. If you're drunk or under other pathological conditions, you can do it. But if you're conscious, if you can deliberate about these choices, one versus the other, and then execute, in that sense, it's a free decision. It's not a random decision, right? It's very different from a random decision. Let's say that quantum, quantum indeterminacy would impose on you.
So in terms of, you guys obviously rely heavily on neural correlates of consciousness when they look at all the. I know limits experiments a lot of it's been changed since then and updated. But I think Uri Miles has done different research. Do you think that those studies, obviously they contradict this view?
No. Why do they contradict this view?
Well, because obviously they're claiming that there is no free will studies.
No, it depends who you ask. What they actually show. So Uri Miles was a postdoc with me for many years, right? And we published a paper on this. What you can show that there are precedents, there are correlates, no question. And some of these correlates go back 10 seconds, no question about it. Now, you have to think these are very different decisions. Typically, these are decisions you randomly, the classical limit experiments, of course, you're free to raise whatever. So this is a choice that makes no difference in the world, right? It's very different when there's actually, so I'm talking about the freedom of choice when there's, there are two avenues. You either go to, you've got two offers for jobs, two offers for grad school. You decide one to the other. You decide whether to get married or something, right? Where actually it makes a real difference, not just, well, I'm going to do this now or 1 second later. But clearly, it's a physicalist theory, so of course there will be correlation. But what do we tell each of our students every single day? Correlation, repeat after me, correlation is not causation, right? Correlation is not causation. So why do we suddenly believe that just because there's a correlate, of course there will be a correlate, there's no magic, right? Of course there's correlate, but there will be lots of correlates, and by the way, all of these correlates are after the fact, right? Yes, so I take 100 experiments, I do 100 trials, I always align it precisely, and then if I look back on all those trials in my average, yes, I can see correlates, no question about it. But that's very different from seeing actually what are the actual causes. And according to IT, the real cause is the intrinsic causal power. The real sort of metaphysical work, if you want, is being done by the intrinsic causal power. But of course it requires a physical substrate. And the physical substrate, if you correlate it, there will be correlations. So in that sense, it's completely compatible with the Ben Libet account of Uri Miles or Sue et al. and all these other people that look for correlates in fMRI and ECOG.
Oh well, I think that segues perfectly to the next part because if your choices do matter, your theory of consciousness also has other implications. But if free will is a concept that's compatible with this, how do we look at this in a sort of holistic view? What I'm trying to ask is, when you think about your approach to consciousness, what are some of the ethical implications it has, or how can someone perceive reality, the world to exist, the world to live? What's the purpose behind all of this? Is it able to give us some sort of an answer to this question?
Yeah, meaning. Well, so the meaning has to come from intrinsic. There is no external meaning. There is no God. Certainly not within IIT that provides any meaning. So any meaning, it's an intrinsic account. Has to come from intrinsic. From the inner perspective. So in this case, you have a self. So you need a notion of self, and the self constructs a sense of meaning.
So, and something, I mean, I don't know if this is too much information to ask you, but your journey from being spiritual, religious to possibly atheist and not conforming to religion, how did that happen and why?
Well, so, I probably went to 1,500 masses as a Catholic, was an altar boy, I raised my kids Catholic. But never once had I ever had a single direct evidence of validity, of the existence of, you go there, you eat the body of Christ, you drink the blood of Christ, by standard, sacraments. You go back, you eat the host and all that. You go back to your pew, you kneel there, you do, everything that's expected of you, but nothing. There's no direct evidence. And then, you go to an ayahuasca ceremony or some of these other ceremonies, and you view the body of something, of a plant in this case, and you have these extraordinary transcendent experiences, right? And so, so then you lose, given that evidentiary state, it's I can now see it for what it is. It serves its function, etc. But I don't. That's why I love my faith. In the absence, it's not compatible with the scientific understanding of the world, and there's no direct evidence to support it. On the other hand, I'm still very spiritual because you can have extraordinary experiences, particularly once you lose a sense of self. Mm-hmm. And the world is actually, particularly if you lose a sense of self, you realize just how beautiful the world is, how compelling it is, and the mere miracle of existence. You wake up, you're sort of in a forest, and you have this extraordinary, vision of this forest in depth, extended, everything moving, everything organic, and it's just easy with this overwhelming sense of awe and beauty.
I love that. I mean, it's very true. I think a lot of people do associate losing a faith with a sort of down thought, but it can be very positive and uplifting. A very big part of this podcast is also, I mean, we touched on consciousness, free will, or another aspect is spirituality, which you touched on, mortality, which is another part. When you look at death, I mean, you've had a near-death experience. It's something you have personally experienced, an out-of-body experience per se, but what do you think happens to consciousness?
With I didn't have an out-of-body, I had a near-death experience.
Sorry, near-death.
Well, in the sense that I got myself into some circumstances I won't go into, but then you come to this place of there's just this bright light of overwhelming intensity. There's no color, no motion, nothing else, no depth, nothing except this bright light. It wasn't on a black canvas. There wasn't anything there. There was no pain, no pleasure, no sound, no fury, nothing except that, and no time, no passage of time, but then fear and terror. So that happened at the early on in the pandemic. Yes, and then sort of I totally lost my fear of death. And clearly, what happens in death is a dissolution of consciousness. So you can look at it and what happens in the brain. In fact, there's just today there's this interesting paper that is coming out in 4 patients who are on life support, and then with the agreement of their loved ones, the life support was turned off. but they still had high-density EEG nets, so you can see what happens in two of these four brains. You had this big surge called a late surge in gamma activity over the back of the brain. And so the traditional story of death is your EEG will just continuously go down until it's flatlined, isoelectric. But that may not be the case. There may be these instances, these surges where at least for a minute or two or three, you get these very intense surges that may be associated with some near-death experiences that are then actually death experiences. So, in death, consciousness is extinguished.
Do you think that's a similar experience to what happens under anesthesia?
It may be, but anesthesia, you get this additional complication. You also get memory. So it's really interesting. So I recently had, a standard colonoscopy, right? We all do it at some point in our life. And phenomenologically, what happens is you're being prepped, right? They roll you into the OR. You talk to the doctor. I tell him, yeah, I'm interested in consciousness, and he talks to me, and they start the drip, and I say I can feel it. And phenomenologically, the next thing, the nurse says, Dr. Koch, wake up. So 2 hours have passed, right? So it feels like sort of you abruptly lose consciousness and then you regain consciousness 2 hours. But then, if you talk to the doctor, actually, what happens as they infuse the, isoflurane? No. No, I'm trying to remember what the agent was. As they infuse it, you lose, because it's called conscious sedation, so you can still breathe by yourself. They don't need to breathe for you, which makes it much lower and which makes it, less risky. But you can still be aroused if they talk to you very loudly. If they say, Christof, do this, then you can still do it. So there may well be that you're conscious, certainly doing that operation, but you don't put down the memory trace. Right? And of course, if you don't put down the memory trace, how do you know you were conscious, right? And so, who knows what happens in death? And of course, modern death happens very often in the clinic where you are drugged anyhow, you're often an opiate because of pain medication, which might, which is going to lead to very different states. So it's unclear. It really depends probably on the detailed form how you're actually going to go from being to non-being.
Christof, when you look at all the theories of consciousness out there, the neuroscientific ones, the ones that either compete with your theory or that actually help it, when you think of the ones that do align with it out there, which ones would those be? Do you think there are other theories of consciousness that are similar? Do you think that others are along the same path and you guys are going to meet somewhere midway?
Well, Victor Lamy, the local feedback. That's the idea. You need some sort of feedback, and in a pure feed-forward network, like a deep convolution network, you can't get consciousness. So there's certainly ideas like that around. But there are few really very well-developed theories. So what I mean by that, so for example, Francis Crick and I, we never claimed we had a theory of consciousness. We had a working hypothesis that 40 hertz gamma oscillation could be a relevant marker for consciousness, but that's not a theory of consciousness. We never claimed so. So all sorts of people have theories of consciousness because they think, well, quantum mechanics is important. Well, maybe that's true, but that's not a theory of consciousness. That's just a hunch what the relevant physical scale is. Even though it's true, it's not a theory. You need for example, none of the quantum mechanics people have ever explained how do you get two different characters. Why does color feel different from space, feel different from an orgasm, right? You ultimately have to explain that. And so there are actually very few theories around that sort of, by that standard. Kevin, I see it's past the hour, and I have my next call coming up.
No problem. Thanks so much, Christof. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to chat to you. I've been looking for it for a long time. Hopefully we can chat soon sometime.
Thanks for asking. You asked some good questions. Thank you much.
Yeah.
All right, take care.
Take care. Keep well.